Back at it. This is part 2 of chapter 10, and it's still snowing out. Now we're going to look at parole evidence and title and risk of loss. Kind of some dry stuff, but it's things that we need to know. Parole evidence is there's something called the parole evidence rule, and parole means oral. In many foreign languages. So what we're looking at is if there is a disagreement that parole evidence rule is in place. Prior information that has been agreed upon orally or agreed upon outside of the particular contract will not be allowed into court. What is looked at, though, is course of dealing, usage of trade, course of performance, and if all else fails, then what comes down to is called rules of construction. So course of dealing looks at previous action that establishes a common understanding of how the contract should be implemented, or the intended terms of the contract. Usage of trade, right here, looks at the practice and how it's regularly viewed within that trade. And the course of performance is the conduct of both parties. May indicate what was meant by the contract. And a lot of times there's still disagreements, so you have to go back and step back and look at it and say, okay, which is the priority? So you'll look at the express terms, what is in the contract. You'll look at the course of performance next, the course of dealing, and then finally about how normally a contract of this nature is performed in the trade. So there's a little bit of prioritizing and some things that the court can look at. The other area that the courts look at, and that is if the contract is just simply unfair and one-sided, where it takes advantage of one party. And the courts have three choices here. They can refuse to enforce the contract if it's just terrible. They can enforce it without the unconscionable clause, or they can limit the unconscionable clause to avoid the result. It's three things that they can look at it as they go through that. The final thing we want to look at in this chapter is called the title and the risk of loss. And the first thing you have to define is, when does that title pass hands? The UCC has two ways of looking at it. They will look at the identification, they'll look at the risk of loss, and they will look at also the insurable interest. So let's look at the identification. First of all, the item must exist and it must be identifiable. So if it's existing goods, the title would pass at the time of contract. If it's future goods, let's say you're purchasing a horse that is yet to be born or conceived even, the title passes at the moment of conception. If it's planting seed, it's when it's planted. If it's a large mass, when it's marked for shipment or it's designated for shipment. Those are ways to identify it. So that's when it's identified. If the title passes when it's agreed upon by the parties, i.e. up here for future goods, it's identified at conception, but those parties will not pass title until they can either agree on when it's born, after it's at a point where it could be transferred, when it's mature. Same thing with existing goods. You could do it at the time of contract. You identify it. but when does that title pass? And then that can be agreed upon by the parties. Not designated when the goods are delivered means that if there's no designation, if there's nothing written up in the contract, it's when the goods are delivered to the buyer. Or you can do it by shipping contracts. Sometimes if I have to ship it, or if you have to ship it, and you can have a shipment contract which says the minute I give it to that carrier, it's the buyer's. In that case, that's where that insurability comes into play. The buyer would maybe want to insure it on that carrier until it reaches until it reaches the buyer. Or if it's a destination contract, that means the seller is responsible until it's taken off the docks at wherever they're shipping it at, or it's in the buyer's hands. In that case, the seller would want to insure it. So that would be when you have goods moving. Now you can buy goods without movement, such as things that are being stored in a warehouse and you're going to leave them in that warehouse. So that would be maybe your title would pass hands when you receive the contract. And without a document, when it was made, when was the contract made. So those are definable passage of titles. Most of all, it depends on what's agreed upon by the parties. So then you have to look at the risk of loss when you get to this point, especially when you're using shipping contracts. These two, with movement, it becomes, if it's a shipment contract, the buyer's risk. And again, I mentioned most people would insure it if it's a high risk or a high dollar volume good. The buyer would insure it. If it's a destination contract, then it's the seller's risk. And again, if it's a high dollar item, it would be insured. Without movement, you're going to have what we call a bailee. So the risk of loss is when the buyer receives the title or contract of the sale. To get a contract breach, you would have a shipment of non-conforming goods, which is a new term which we're going to go over in Chapter 11. If it's a shipment of non-conforming goods, then the seller must correct it or cure it, as they say, and the buyer must accept it or reject it. And if they accept non-conforming goods, then they do so at their own risk. That comes back to this insurable interest, and that can be both by the buyer and the seller, just depending on the type of contract that is involved. That wraps up Chapter 10, and that was much easier than listening to 20 minutes, right? So see you in Chapter 11.